Welcome to the Wolverine Confidential Podcast. I am Andrew Kahn, joined by my MLive sports colleagues.
Ryan Zuke.
Aaron McMann.
A lot of news to talk about since our last episode. Some of it was expected, some of it was not. The latter would be John Beilein, Michigan basketball head coach, interviewing for the Detroit Pistons head coaching vacancy. What was your guys' reaction to that news? It kind of came out of nowhere.
It did, and I didn't find out really until I read your story this morning or late last night when I got back from my golf trip up north this weekend. So
did you play as many holes as I did at the miniature golf course? I played 54 holes.
I beat you. I beat you.
Oh, wow.
90 holes.
90 holes.
90 holes in 3 days. Yeah. So my back is burning right now. Aching. Tired a little bit, but we're doing all right. We'll recover.
Wow, what was your best score for those 5 rounds?
Yeah, well, it was Saturday and Sunday was a scramble format, so tournament with 40 other guys. So we were 6 under each time, each round. So finished 18 under, 3rd place. So not bad. So, but good time. As you can see, it was sunny throughout on Saturday. 70 degrees and sunny from 9 a.m. till dark, and didn't apply as much sunscreen as I was supposed to. But yeah, I did read your story, and I was pretty surprised.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
To answer your question.
Aaron, you are a Michigan football writer, but in the past you have been the Detroit Pistons writer for MLive. You know basketball very well. You must have been. What was your reaction?
I still get Woj's tweets sent to my phone, so I saw it the minute he tweeted it. I was a little surprised. Beilein's name isn't one you really, kind of throw in with NBA openings. He just doesn't seem like that type of guy. So I was a little surprised. But the more I read from stuff that you put out and others have put out, and I've had discussions with other folks, I guess I'm not surprised. Obviously you can go more in depth, and you know more than I do. But when the NBA calls or wants to interview, I think you have to at least listen. So I don't know. I was surprised initially, but now I'm not so surprised.
Right. I mean, he's 65 years old. He's coming off a national championship appearance. The core of that team is back. Good recruiting class coming in. Good recruiting classes, on the horizon. So it seems like this is maybe a strange time. I know kind of the first reaction is, okay, we heard just a few weeks ago to stay tuned for a contract extension. Now, it's not like this year is the last year of his deal or anything like that. He signed through the 2020-21 season, so he's here for a few years. But as you know, in college sports, it's good to lock these coaches up as long-term as possible for recruiting purposes. So, the first thought was, okay, is this leverage for, kind of speed up the contract negotiations? I mean, I think that's a fair assumption, but there's really no evidence either way to support that. I've talked to some parents of players, some recruits in that 2019 class, some of the incoming freshmen and current players, and not all of them have spoken with Beilein directly. He has reached out to others. He was in Colorado this weekend for Team USA under 18 tryouts. Michigan has a couple players they're targeting that are participating in that. And he addressed it with them, but very, very briefly. It was like, well, we'll talk about this later. You're here for something else. So yeah, nothing really came out of that I could discern.
That's interesting though, because recruits or even players are coming to the program now. They're going to want to know. Is their coach going to be around next year?
Correct. Yeah, they see this stuff. They're following the same people. We are on Twitter. They're seeing it. It's being talked about. So it's interesting. I mean, I would think the Pistons have a few more interviews to do.
And they've had several already.
Several
names have popped up.
MLive.com/Pistons is where you can read about this from OnStar.
Seems like they're in no rush to hire someone, though. I mean, it's been how long?
Yeah, since? I mean, they've got moving pieces with when they didn't just fire their coach, but he was also their president, and now the GM's out, so it's kind of a new regime coming in, trying to figure things out. So it's a question of who was first interested in Beilein, and now is this new team in place still interested in him? But as far as whether his style could work in the NBA, I think that's another assumption. Is like, all right, this guy is he's all about. He's not a drill sergeant, and then he's not a yeller, but he's literally drill focused. Footwork and pivoting and bounce passes and landing on 2 feet and all this stuff. But as I put in my story, which you read last night, you said, I dug up a interview that Andrew Bogut of the formerly of the Golden State Warriors, did, where he said when Steve Kerr came in a few years ago, that's how he treated the first training camp. It was, we turn the ball over too much. We're going to pass the ball into nets, and we're going to do all these little things. Beilein would probably do the same things, and he actually has a track record of success, at least at the college level. Steve Kerr had never been a coach.
Right.
It might have worked out a little bit for Golden State, I would say.
Yeah, so I think they saw the fruits of it pretty quickly. And yeah, so I don't think that that's really be a deterrent for an NBA team hiring him.
Like you said, though, I mean, he's 65, and if you go to the NBA, I mean, isn't maybe standard of life a little less, I mean, not stressful, but I mean, you're not on the road recruiting all year, and there is maybe some benefits in open up your schedule a little bit. Obviously, longer season, but there are some benefits if you
could spend. I mean, you could spend almost the entire season with players in the off season. You can choose to work out with guys. Obviously, a lot of guys go home and they go, wherever they're from. A lot of them go out to LA and California for workouts with personal trainers and things. But coaches, I mean, they can ask players to come in and do workouts with them. They can do stuff in the off season if everyone is for it. But there's definitely more hands-on opportunities in the NBA. You're working with players nonstop. You develop more, I think, a rapport with them. There's no NCAA restrictions saying you can only spend X amount of hours with them. So there's a lot more there. For someone like him, it's interesting to me because in the NBA, head coaches are always hired to be fired. You hear that in other leagues too. A lot of guys don't have sustainable paths there. I mean, you've had a few like Greg Popovich. Steve Kerr's obviously been very successful in Golden State, but you saw with Van Gundy, who before Detroit had only missed the playoffs once. He had lengthy tenures in Orlando and Miami. He didn't get it done in Detroit. So at the end of the day, if he's looking to go to the NBA, I think, I don't know if it's in his mind. I don't know if he's thinking like maybe this is his last, hoorah, his last.
Right. This probably would be his last chance to make that move. But as Ryan was saying, the lifestyle, there is an off season in the NBA. There's really not as a college coach because of recruiting.
Right.
You are. But I don't know. I don't see him making the move because he feels overworked. I think the last few years he's really delegated more to his assistants on that front. So. It's hard to see. My main point here is I don't think that he's the kind of guy who's taking these interviews for fun because he's bored. I think there was a serious interest there on both sides. Where that ends up, I don't know. But if it was for some leverage to speed up negotiations, I think that maybe just be part of the reason. There's no way that he's just playing a game here with Michigan administration.
And there's something I think you brought up and others have written about too, but the assistant coaching pay. I think that's an issue. I don't know how he feels about that, but if you look at the numbers and you compare Michigan's assistant coaching pool salary, it's significantly less than some of the other Big Ten counterparts. So I don't know if that factors in. I mean, I don't know, but there's a lot of things to weigh here. Whether it's interest or his time here, his contract situation, his assistant salary. I don't think it's one thing. It's never one thing. It's always multiple things. But yeah, it was interesting development last week.
Yeah, and I'm sure for the average person, it's hard for them to coaches making millions or these assistants in the six figures, to feel sorry for them. But the bottom line is there's a market, and there were 3 new head coaches in the Big Ten last year, in Ohio State, Indiana, and Illinois, and their assistant coach salaries for their 3 assistants at Indiana was over $1 million, or maybe Ohio State over $1 million, Indiana $900,000, Illinois $800 something, Michigan's was like $600 something combined. Yeah. So it is lagging behind. Now, granted, they were 2 first-year assistants in major conference basketball, another one in his second year, but still, the fact is those were new regimes at these other schools too, and then they got paid right away. Yeah. So I don't know. You got both sides that they seem to want to get it done. I mean, Ward Manuel has said he wants him to be here for life.
Yeah.
So you got to think it will get done. I would think if John Beilein goes to the Pistons, it's because he decided he wants to take this challenge and coach the best of the best, not because contract negotiations fell apart.
It would be a challenge too. I mean, the Pistons roster isn't without flaws. I mean, their salary cap situation is not ideal. I mean, there are some flaws there. I mean, you cover them for a season or two.
Yeah,
I mean,
there isn't a lot of wiggle room there.
Right.
I mean, they don't have a first-round pick this year. They're like you said, they're maxed out. They're paying in the luxury tax right now, so they can't make a trade for someone in theory with more value. It's going to have to be a value for value trade. So, say Beilein was to go to the Pistons, he would basically have to work with the roster he has. Now, that could be a good thing. You know, a fresh face, a fresh voice. Maybe I know. You know, some of the players might have gotten sick of Van Gundy after a while, and that's to be expected. But you know, with an NBA, it'd be a different environment for him, different situation. It would be interesting. You know, you mentioned his style and his offense, and I think it would translate well. My only question would be from him having coached college his entire career, would the players buy into him right away? That's the question. The NBA is a lot of egos, a lot of guys are making a lot more than the coaches are. So it's a balancing act for a lot of head coaches.
Yeah, now, I mean, I guess all the more reason from the Pistons' perspective to go outside the box when your roster isn't. You're not going to compete just on your talent alone, so why not go for a guy who is known for maximizing the talent he does have. There was some other news that we touched on in last week's episode that I feel like we should bring some closure to. With Charles Matthews is back. Seems like old news at this point, but he is returning. That is very important for Michigan. He's the leading scorer and rebounder that's coming back, given that Wagner is gone. And Jalen Wilson, a 4-star recruit,
that's right.
A top 40 kid in the 2019 class, committed to Michigan. So, he and others are among those that are, have had contact with Beilein about this situation. But I don't think it has not hurt them in any way on the recruiting trail yet. We'll see. I mean, these rumors come up with Calipari at Kentucky all the time. They come up with Izzo in the past, and it hasn't seemed to hurt them at all. So we'll see.
I suspect you'll get an answer relatively quickly. The Pistons obviously have been interviewing several people. I would expect them to make a move relatively soon, and they do need someone in place relatively quickly. And Beilein, I'm sure, wants closure to it if he's genuinely serious and interested in this.
The draft is in a few weeks, so you kind of would like.
That season's about to be over. I mean, Golden State already up 2-0.
Yeah.
We'll see how long the Cavs and LeBron can last.
Yes. Well, let's move on to Michigan football here.
Yeah.
Aaron, if you could just tell us, what was this event that you were at where Jim Harbaugh spoke and some other coaches spoke? What was it?
Yeah, we were at a Sunday. We made the drive out to Grand Valley State University, the Best of the Midwest football camp. It tracks hundreds of high school kids from around the region. It's yearly. It's kind of it kind of fed off of the old Sound Mind, Sound Body camp that was in the Detroit area for so many years. Sound Mind, Sound Body is actually a sponsor of this thing. But they've kind of rebranded it a little bit. But it's been, I think it's the second straight year they've had at Grand Valley State. They bring in coaches and coaching staffs from several D1, D2 programs around the region, around the country. Jim Harbaugh was one of the main speakers who brought most of his coaching staff. So it was a lively event. He showed up, gave it. It was a brief 4 or 5 minute speech. Didn't say a whole lot of stuff we hadn't really heard before. He kind of urged the campers to do what their coaches tell them, play their best, and things would work out for them. It was a typical Harbaugh speech, nothing out of the ordinary, but it wasn't bad. It was interesting events. Those camps are always fascinating because you got the kids there who are always the high profile, the 5 and 4 stars. There were a couple of those, but then you've got all these kids who aren't. In fact, there was one point early on when they were speaking, and some of the other speakers were going, and one of the guys that kind of was introducing everyone, but he asked the campers, how many of you are 5 stars, how many of you are 4 stars, and he went down to 2, and then he's like, how many of you have no stars? I'd say 60% of the kids that were there weren't being recruited by anyone. So they were looking for exposure. They were looking to try and impress some of these coaches. So those camps are always fascinating, and it's camp season. Harbaugh and the coaching staff began their satellite camp schedule last week. This was part of it. Harbaugh started, I think, in Georgia at Mercer University. Then they went up to Cleveland. He was in Tennessee Martin, and then he made the I think the drive over yesterday morning at Grand Valley.
So even though Harbaugh was, I don't know if keynote speaker would be the right term, but he was,
He was the final one.
Okay, so there you go.
Didn't make the biggest headlines, though, did
Right,
it?
there was. There doesn't
Yes.
mean there weren't other coaches there who spoke, including
Yes,
Meyer.
yeah, Urban Meyer was interesting. Before that, before Urban and Harbaugh spoke, Chris Creighton, Eastern Michigan, gave a rousing speech. He was very fiery. That was followed up by John Beilein, the Central Michigan head coach, who was the total opposite, very soft-spoken, very quiet. Went over his battle with cancer, which I thought was very relatable, or at least very something to listen to. And then it followed up with Western Michigan's coach, Tim Lester. So those three started. Then the person that was kind of emceeing the event gave this like 5-minute thing about urging the kids to be careful on social media and be careful what they do and not to get in trouble, that type of stuff. But then, yeah, the Urban Meyer situation I think was the most interesting. I wrote about it last night on MLive.com, Sunday night. Meyer was never advertised for this thing. He was a last-minute addition. I think he was added Friday or Saturday. One of their national recruiting writers wrote out or tweeted out that Urban Meyer was planning on showing up. I'm assuming he was invited. He did show up. It was kind of the event was supposed to get going at I think at 10:30. Didn't end up starting until around 11. But Meyer strolled in. I saw maybe one or two of his assistants. He didn't bring his whole staff, whereas Harbaugh brought almost his entire coaching staff was there. Most of Eastern Michigan staff was there, Western. So most of the coaches that spoke, their entire staff. Meyer was not. He brought maybe one or two assistants. Walks in wearing a 2014 National Championship jacket. He was chatting with a few of the coaches. I saw him chatting at length with John Beileins, the Central Michigan coach, former Lions assistant. Obviously, there was some familiarity there. He spoke at length with Jim McElwain, the former Florida coach, who's now in Harbaugh's staff. But then he ended up speaking. He spoke right before Harbaugh preceded him. Clearly, it was organized because they had the screen up behind him with his name and a little biography. So they were clearly planning on this. But Meyer, 4 or 5 minutes, he was basically a two-pronged. What's the right word? He basically trolled Jim Harbaugh. It was 4 or 5 minutes. It was he started off his very first sentence. I have most of it transcribed right now. I'm very fortunate in Ohio State. The last 6 years, really, we've had more players drafted in the country. And then he went on to list some of the guys he coached. Then it went on. He basically told these campers, two things. He looks for guys who are. He brought Bill Belichick first off. He goes, when Bill Belichick comes in, he asks me, what type of kids do you have? And he goes, well, they want to know two things. What kind of teammate are you, and how do you perform in the big game? So Meyer went on for a little bit about being what kind of teammate you are, being responsible, being showing up for practice on time, that type of thing. But I'd say most of the speech was focused on how do you perform in the big game. Now it was interesting because Harbaugh was standing right, I'd say 30 feet away from Meyer, watching this whole thing go down. He was going to follow up Meyer afterwards, but there were no references to Michigan, no reference to Harbaugh, but there were several things about how do you perform in your rivalry game. I'm not looking at you. When I'm sent tape, I'm not looking at you and perform in t-shirts and shorts.
Like 40-0 blowouts.
40-0 blowouts. But he made 4 or 5 references to rivalry games. Mm-hmm. And in high school, yes, the rivalries are a big deal, but I just found it fascinating that he kept bringing that up and Harbaugh was standing right there.
What a power move!
It was interesting because he kind of strolled in late. I would say Meyer was probably one of the final coaches to show up. He gave the speech, and then he left. He didn't stay for the camp. Afterwards, after the speeches were done, all the campers went outside. That's when they did the drills, and the coaches ran some of the things. Don Brown was very, very involved. Harbaugh was walking around. All the coaches were there. Meyer was nowhere to be found. He left. So he literally strolled in, gave a speech, and strolled out. I found it interesting,
But he can. We talked about this with Woodson's comments a few weeks ago.
He can, yeah.
They've won.
Yeah, 13 out of the last 14.
Yeah, 6 in a row, 13 of the last 14. He has the clout at this point. Mm-hmm. Michigan can say all they want, and they can. I mean, I think it sounds like Charles Woodson wants them to. They wants them to speak more. But I think from Harbaugh's perspective and his players, they realize they can't beat Ohio State, so there shouldn't be a lot of talking. And Harbaugh it certainly isn't the one to talk, to boast about his team, at least first. If someone prompts him to, he might. And we saw that, prior to last season, he did that quite a bit. When coaches would take a shot at him or his Michigan program, he would typically fire back. He's been more reserved the last year. I think part of that is, maybe the lack of winning, the fewer wins that they've had. I don't know. We asked Harbaugh after the fact. We spoke to him, the reporters that were on scene at the time. We spoke to him after the speeches were done, and we asked him about a bevy of topics. One of which was the Woodson comment, if he had thoughts on it, and he didn't want to talk about it. He basically said, we have emphasized it. I'm there every day, and I see it. But Harbaugh clearly didn't want to talk about it. So it was an interesting, morning, just given Meyer's speech and the rivalry, the comments, and everything else. So it was fascinating just to watch it transpire.
Then there was some other news as far as, I don't know if he addressed this at this camp.
He did.
But the whole offensive coordinator situation. Yeah. I guess if you could just share briefly the facts of the situation, or what was said.
Yeah, we asked him about it beginning of spring, and I think I was the one that asked him actually whether he decided an offensive coordinator, because once spring practice began, there was the coaching staff was set, but no one had the official title of offensive coordinator. Mm-hmm. Last year it was Tim Drevno, who also coached the offensive line, but it was it was made obvious that Drevno wasn't the only one calling plays. It was Drevno and assistant head coach and passing game coordinator Pep Hamilton. He had input as well. And in fact, we saw in the Amazon documentary, at least from what we saw, most of the play calls came from Pep Hamilton. Now, maybe that was because they focused solely on passing plays. I don't know. But Harbaugh had confirmed that both of them kind of collaborated on play calls. Now, Harbaugh also made a point of saying that he has the final say on play calls. Right. So I don't know how much input he has on a daily basis, on a regular basis. But he certainly has the final say.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on this.
Yeah.
And Ryan, you could chime in. I mean, I think it's helpful. It's probably helpful for someone's salary as far as whether they have that title, and if they want to go somewhere else, they could say, "Hey, I was the offensive coordinator here." But Jim Harbaugh is the offensive coordinator, is he not? I mean, of head coaches usually are one side of the ball or the other.
Correct.
Overseeing everything.
Correct.
But I mean, he's an offensive guy. He played the position, and that's sort of where he came up when he was doing some, help assistant work. Right? Isn't
he? He's the leader. I mean, he's the guy that it's his offense. If you want to knock Michigan's offense, you want to criticize it, you want to praise it, whatever. At the end of the day, the buck stops with Jim Harbaugh. Mm-hmm. He's envisioned this. He's put these assistants in place because he wants them there for a specific reason. He's helped recruit. He's recruited specifically these quarterbacks to play a particular offense and fit a certain mold. It is his offense. It's been fascinating this spring to hear the comments. I mean, Jim McElwain came in for obviously the new wide receivers coach, former head coach at Florida, Colorado State, former offensive coordinator at Alabama. You asked them about where they fit in the offense, and McElwain had some interesting comments when we first talked to him back in April. He called it Pep Hamilton's show. He said, Pep Hamilton's been calling, he's organizing things. He's the one that's kind of running the show. And then you talk to Pep Hamilton, and he makes it sound like, no, this is more of a collaborative thing. This is Jim Harbaugh has the final say. This is not so much on me. So it's been back and forth almost. It's been an interesting thing to follow.
Yeah.
But even last year, I mean, he was asked about his play calling constantly throughout the year, and he always would accept, I have the final decision. And so, I mean, if there's any blame, he would accept that too.
That's a great point. I feel like that's what he was, especially how poorly the offense was last year, and really the last couple of years. If it was more shielding another coach from the blame that would come if he was the coordinator. At the same time, by not saying it's me, that allows the speculation and the buck can be passed. So it's it almost,
and it's
you
also,
can't win.
You mentioned the shield thing, and it's possible he's doing this because you saw the flack that Tim Drevno got last year when the offense wasn't doing well, and it was poor most of the season. Drevno got most of that because in theory he had the offensive coordinator title. He was in theory the guy, but come to find out, I think Pep Hamilton may have had more of an influence on that offense than most people thought. So where exactly the power is going to be interesting. Harbaugh made an interesting comment. I asked him again yesterday, after the speech. I asked him about it again. I was the one that brought it up, and he made the comment that he made the analogy. And some people, I've heard this before. There are too many. He said too many chiefs. But you can make it similar. Too many cooks in the kitchen.
Take out the eye.
Yeah. Whatever. Chefs. Whatever. So it's. I know people want to focus on this because they're thinking, if the offense is bad, there's too many people dialing up plays or suggesting things. But yes, at the end of the day, this is Jim Harbaugh's show. It's his offense. He has final say on things, and maybe that's not a good thing. I don't know. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's not. But we saw last year the offense struggled, and there's so many question marks again going into this year. So it's going to be an interesting thing to follow.
Yeah, I just saw in your story, like Drevno, who's now at USC, has the title of, I don't think he's the offensive coordinator.
He's a running backs coach
and pass protection
coordinator.
I mean, football's a complicated game. I get that, but it's almost like, okay, you're creating these literally pass protect. It's like, all right, if we're going to run to the left, then this is the guy who calls it. But if we're passing between 6 and 12 yards, this is.
Oh, keep in mind, I mean, that's almost how Michigan's coaching staff was last year. They had 2 offensive line coaches, Greg Fry, who was in charge of tackles and tight ends, and then you had Jim Drevno, who was the offensive line coach and the passing game or the offensive coordinator. So you had essentially 2 guys coaching the offensive line. So it was an interesting dynamic. I think things are more flushed out now. You've got Ed Warner is now in charge of the whole offensive line. You've got a wide receivers coach, because last year too, Pep Hamilton was, he had the title of passing game coordinator, and he still does, and he's also added the title of quarterbacks coach this year, even though being passing game coordinator would imply being the quarterbacks coach. But Pep Hamilton also had influence in the wide receivers last year. That's kind of been taken off of him now. Jim McElwain has that job, so I think things are more rounded now, which may help. But again, I guess one of the reasons I keep asking Harbaugh is I keep getting questions from the fans. They want to know who's the offensive coordinator, who's in charge of this thing. Right. And obviously the answer is always Jim Harbaugh. But folks did watch the documentary. They have read things, and they realize Pep Hamilton also has a huge influence on this thing.
I mean, I think it can work. You look at this podcast, very little structure, no official titles, and I think it works. So we'll see. We thank you for listening, for watching. Please subscribe. And Wolverine Confidential back at you next week.